Lyra's fingers hovered over the jagged ridge of skin running from his collarbone to his ribs. There was a silence so deep it pulled in the light of the world. He didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. He sat like a monument of meat and memory while she searched for a single spark in the hollow space where a soul should be. In that proximity, the air between them felt heavy, charged with the weight of everything he refused to say. It turned out that Ether 7 was the perfect place for a ghost to hide. The trade hub was a spinning collection of pressurized corridors and flickering neon where the galaxy's discarded parts came to work until they simply stopped. Kalen Jax was one of those parts. He had arrived 6 months ago, a man who moved with a predatory grace he clearly tried to hide under the slumped shoulders of a freight loader. He was a laborer, a face in the crowd, a ghost among ghosts. Lyra was drawn to him because he was a vacuum. As an empath, the station was usually a screaming chorus of greed, exhaustion, and cheap lust, but Jax was a dead zone. When he walked past her clinic, the noise of the world stopped. It was unnerving. Truth is, it was the only peace she had ever known. The accident in the loading docks had been messy. A gravity stabilizer failed, and a crate of raw ore had nearly pinned him to the bulkhead. He had walked to the clinic himself, trailing blood across the deck plates without a single grimace or a word of complaint. Now, under the cool, sterile glow of the overhead lights, Lyra saw the reality of him. He was a map of pain etched in surgical scars and military ink. Her blue fingers trembled slightly as she applied the dermal knit, the scent of antiseptic and recycled air filling the small space. Every time her skin brushed his, she expected a jolt of agony or a flash of trauma. Instead, she felt nothing. No anger, no fear, just a vast, cold stillness. It was as if he had hollowed himself out to make room for the things he had done. In fact, the silence was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight. She wanted to ask him where a man learned to carry such a burden without buckling. She wanted to know why his heart beat with the slow, steady rhythm of a machine rather than a living being. But she didn't speak. She simply finished the treatment, watching the way his large, calloused hands rested on his knees. Ironically, those were the hands that broke an empire. Though she didn't know that yet. She only saw the way they shook almost imperceptibly when he thought she wasn't looking. After he left, the stillness he carried stayed in the room, making the air feel thin. Lyra found herself at the terminal, her pulse quickening. She shouldn't have looked. Accessing the restricted hegemony archives was a high-level offense, but the void in him demanded an explanation. The screen flickered, its pale light reflecting off her scales as the encrypted files finally yielded. The Reaper of Zaros. The name felt like a cold blade against her throat. The file described your weapon that chose to become a man again, or perhaps a man who had been forced to become a weapon. He was the ghost who had systematically dismantled the Varkas hegemony, assassinating its immortal lords and vanishing into the stars. He wasn't just a laborer. He was the most dangerous human ever born, and he was currently sleeping in a hab unit 3 levels down. The blade was a sliver of cold light against Malgore's throat. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the docking bay was the frantic, wet rasp of a man who realized he had hunted the wrong monster. Jax didn't look like a laborer anymore. He didn't even look like a man. He looked like an ending. But then Lyra's hand touched his arm, just a soft, steady weight against the heat of his skin, and the vacuum in his chest finally cracked. High Arbitrator Malgore had arrived with the kind of ceremony that demanded blood. 50 elite warriors, clad in white ceramic plates and carrying high-yield rifles, had turned Sector Gamma into a cage. They came for the Reaper. They came for the bounty that had floated through the stars for a decade, a price tag attached to the man who had ended a dynasty. Ironically, they found exactly what they were looking for, and it was the last mistake they ever made. Jax hadn't wanted to fight. Truth is, he had spent every hour on Ether 7 trying to forget how. But when the first shock grenade shattered the windows of the clinic, the ghost woke up. He moved through the elite squad with a terrifying economy of motion. He was a blur of shadow and impact that made the air feel like it was being squeezed. He didn't waste energy on flourishes. He just broke things. Ribs, visors, spirits. He moved through the warriors, not with anger, but with the weary precision of a man finishing a chore he had prayed was over. And yet through the noise of the struggle and the hiss of steam from broken pipes, Lyra stayed. She didn't run. She watched the way his hands, the hands that had trembled over a deck of cards just the night before, now worked with lethal efficiency. As an empath, she could feel the shift in him. The cold stillness was being replaced by a white-hot burn of necessity. It wasn't the joy of the kill, it was the agony of a man being forced back into his own nightmare. When the last of the warriors lay groaning on the deck, Jax had Malgor pinned against a coolant tank. The arbitrator's eyes were wide, reflecting the man who had erased his masters. The steel in Jax's hand didn't shake. It was as steady as a heartbeat. "Please," Lyra whispered. Her voice was small, but it carried through the wreckage of the docking bay. "Don't let them win by making you him again." Jax froze. His knuckles were white where they gripped the arbitrator's collar. He looked at her, and for the first time, the void wasn't empty. It was full of a jagged, terrifying grief. He saw her blue skin, the kindness in her eyes that he hadn't deserved, and the way she refused to look away from his bloody hands. She wasn't afraid of the Reaper. She was mourning the man. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was human. He let go. The blade clattered onto the deck plates with a sound that seemed to echo forever. Malgor slumped to the floor, a broken figure stripped of his power and his dignity. Jax didn't look back at the carnage. He didn't check for survivors. He walked toward Lyra, his steps heavy with a sudden crushing exhaustion. He reached out, his fingers stopping just short of her face, afraid to stain her with the reality of what he had just done. In the weeks that followed, the hub returned to its usual rhythm. But in a quiet corner of the station, away from the neon and the noise, a man sat at a small table. His hands still shook sometimes, and the map of scars on his chest would never fade. But he wasn't a weapon anymore. He was just a man learning to heal, one quiet breath at a time, while an empath sat across from him and smiled at the sound of his heart finally finding its beat. "Would you like me to generate an image of Kaelin and Lyra in the quiet aftermath on Ether 7?